There's a substance in your kitchen right now that was never supposed to exist. It wasn't discovered. It wasn't refined from something natural. It was invented by accident in a laboratory in 1869, and within 100 years, it had replaced something humans had eaten for millennia. You've eaten it thousands of times. You were told it was healthier. You were told it would save your heart. And for decades, the people who made it knew something you didn't. This is the story of margarine. In the late 1860s, France had a problem. Napoleon III needed a cheap substitute for butter to feed his army and the urban poor. Butter was expensive, scarce, and spoiled quickly. The emperor offered a prize to anyone who could create an alternative. A French chemist named Hippolyte Mejmouillet accepted the challenge. He began experimenting with beef tallow, extracting fats and mixing them with milk. What he created was a pale, greasy substance that resembled butter in texture, but not in taste or color. He called it oleomargarine, from the Greek word for pearl because of its pearlescent sheen. It was soft, it was cheap, it didn't need refrigeration the way butter did, and it could be made in a factory. Mejmouillet won the prize, but he never became wealthy from his invention. He sold the patent to a Dutch company, and margarine began its quiet spread across Europe and into America. At first, it wasn't welcomed. Butter had been part of human life for thousands of years. It appeared in religious texts. It was currency in some cultures. It was food, medicine, and ritual. People knew what it was: cream, churned until the fat separated from the liquid. One ingredient, made by hand or by machine, but always the same process. Margarine was different. It was the first mass-produced food that tried to replace something real with something engineered. Dairy farmers in the United States saw it as a threat. They lobbied for laws to restrict it. By the 1880s, margarine was banned in several states. Where it wasn't banned, it was taxed heavily or forced to be sold uncolored, pale white, so consumers would know it wasn't butter. Some states went further. They required margarine to be dyed pink to make it visually repulsive. The message was clear: this is not food. But margarine manufacturers adapted. They began selling margarine with a small capsule of yellow dye included in the package. Consumers could knead the dye into the margarine themselves, turning it the color of butter. It became a household ritual in some families, mixing the fake into something that looked real. And slowly, over decades, the laws weakened. The taxes were reduced. The bans were lifted. Margarine became normal. What changed wasn't the product. What changed was the science, or rather what people were told about the science. In the 1950s, a researcher named Ancel Keys proposed a theory. He suggested that saturated fat, the kind found in butter, meat, and eggs, was responsible for the rising rates of heart disease in America. He pointed to data from several countries that seemed to show a correlation between fat intake and heart attacks. The theory was compelling, it was simple, and it was promoted aggressively. By the 1960s, the American Heart Association had adopted Keys's hypothesis. Butter, they said, was dangerous. Saturated fat raised cholesterol, and cholesterol caused heart disease. The solution was to replace animal fats with vegetable oils. Margarine, which was made from vegetable oils, became the recommended alternative. It didn't matter that margarine had been created in a lab from beef fat. By this point, it had evolved. Manufacturers had learned how to harden liquid vegetable oils using a process called hydrogenation. They could take cheap oils, cottonseed, soybean, corn, and turn them solid at room temperature. The process involved heating the oils and forcing hydrogen gas through them under high pressure. The result was a fat that behaved like butter, but cost a fraction of the price to produce. It also created something new: trans fats. Trans fats don't exist in nature, not in any meaningful quantity. They are a byproduct of hydrogenation, a molecular rearrangement that makes liquid oils solid. And for most of the 20th century, no one thought they were a problem. Margarine was marketed as heart-healthy. It was endorsed by doctors. It appeared in hospitals, in school cafeterias, in government nutrition programs. Butter was removed from the dietary guidelines and replaced with margarine and vegetable oils. Entire generations grew up being told that butter would kill them. And people believed it. They switched. They bought margarine in plastic tubs and squeezable bottles. They spread it on toast, baked it into cookies, stirred it into mashed potatoes. It became invisible, woven into the texture of everyday meals. But something else was happening, quietly, in the background. By the 1990s, researchers began noticing something strange. Heart disease rates had not declined the way the Keyes hypothesis predicted. In fact, they had continued to rise. And some of the populations that consumed the most margarine were seeing unusual patterns of illness, not just heart disease, but inflammation, metabolic disorders, obesity. Scientists started looking more closely at trans fats. What they found was disturbing. Trans fats didn't just raise LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol, they also lowered HDL cholesterol, the good kind that protects the heart. They triggered inflammation in the arteries, they interfered with cell membrane function, they increased the risk of heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and certain cancers. In 1993, a Harvard study estimated that trans fats were responsible for 30,000 premature deaths per year in the United States alone. Other researchers put the number even higher. The very substance that had been promoted as a life-saving alternative to butter was killing people. And the manufacturers had known, not from the beginning, but long before the public did. Internal documents from food companies in the 1980s show that executives were aware trans fats might pose health risks, but margarine was a billion-dollar industry. Admitting the product was harmful would mean lawsuits, lost revenue, regulatory scrutiny. So the message didn't change. Margarine was still marketed as healthy. It was still recommended by doctors who trusted the guidelines. It was still sold in every grocery store in America. It wasn't until 2003 that the FDA required trans fat content to be listed on nutrition labels. By then, millions of people had spent decades eating it. In 2015, the FDA declared that partially hydrogenated oils, the source of trans fats, were no longer generally recognized as safe. Manufacturers were given 3 years to remove them from the food supply. But the damage had been done. Margarine's story is not just about one ingredient. It's about how food became something that could be designed, not grown. It's about how a substance made from industrial waste, cottonseed oil was originally a byproduct of cotton production, could be rebranded as modern, scientific, safe. It's about how entire populations were taught to distrust food that humans had eaten for thousands of years and to trust food that had been invented in a lab. And it's about what happens when the language of health is used to sell something that was never about health at all. Today, margarine still exists. It's been reformulated. Most brands no longer contain trans fats. They've been replaced with other processed oils, emulsifiers, preservatives. The packaging still uses words like heart-healthy and plant-based. Butter, meanwhile, has quietly returned. The science that demonized it has been questioned, revised, complicated. Saturated fat is no longer seen as the singular villain it once was. Some researchers now argue that the real problem was never butter, it was sugar, refined carbohydrates, and yes, trans fats. But the instinct remains. The instinct to believe that food can be improved by industry, that something made in a factory can be better than something made by a cow. Margarine taught us that lesson. It taught us that food is not just food, it's a product, a message, a lever. And once that lesson is learned, it's hard to unlearn. There's a phrase that appears sometimes in discussions about food history: the margarine model. It refers to the way a product can be introduced as a cheap substitute, gain legitimacy through institutional endorsement, and eventually become normalized, even when the evidence suggests harm. The margarine model didn't end with margarine. It's visible in the rise of industrial seed oils which replaced animal fats in cooking and processed foods. It's visible in artificial sweeteners which were marketed as healthier than sugar. It's visible in ultra-processed foods designed to mimic whole foods, but made from ingredients that didn't exist a century ago. Each time, the pattern is the same. A natural food is framed as dangerous. A synthetic alternative is framed as modern. And by the time the truth emerges, the alternative has already become part of the culture. What's strange is how little resistance there was. Not from consumers, they trusted the experts, and not from doctors, they trusted the studies. The resistance came from small communities, traditionalists, people who simply refused to believe that butter could be bad. They were dismissed as unscientific, nostalgic, out of touch. But they were right. Not because they had better data, not because they understood biochemistry or nutrition science, but because they trusted something older than science, the accumulated wisdom of eating food that had been eaten before, by people who lived long enough to have children, who passed on what worked. That kind of knowledge is slow. It doesn't come from studies. It comes from generations. And it's easy to discard when the language of progress is louder. Margarine is mostly gone now, at least in its original form, but the systems that created it are still here. The same regulatory agencies that promoted margarine now promote other products. The same food companies that sold trans fats now sell other engineered fats. The same nutritional guidelines that told people to avoid butter now tell them to avoid red meat or eggs or salt. Maybe those guidelines are right. Maybe they'll hold up better than the ones that promoted margarine. Or maybe, in 30 years, we'll look back at today the way we now look back at the 1970s and realize we were sold something that was never meant to nourish us. There's a moment in all of this that stays with you. It's not the science, it's not the lawsuits or the policy changes. It's the image of a family in the 1980s sitting down to dinner, a mother spreading margarine on bread for her children, believing she's protecting their hearts, a father eating it without question because the doctor recommended it, and all of them unknowingly consuming something that would damage their health in ways they wouldn't understand for decades. They weren't stupid, they weren't careless. They were doing what they were told to do by people they trusted. And that's the part that's hard to think about. Because if it happened then, with margarine, what's happening now? This ingredient was a factory mistake, but the mistake wasn't just the chemistry. The mistake was believing that food could be rebuilt from scratch, that tradition could be discarded, that the body wouldn't know the difference. The body knew. It always knows. And this is only one chapter in a much larger story.